Hello and welcome to the third module in our Anti-Racism series. In modules 1 and 2, you explored the roots of colonialism and whiteness, and you have critically reflected on your own positionality within a racist society. In module 3, we turn from knowledge and reflection to action. We are your hosts for module 3. My name is Marika Kunis, and I am a long-term occasional teacher in Ontario and a PhD student.
And I am Jean Wan, a core French teacher and instructional coach in Toronto.
This module, Pathways to Being an Anti-Racist Human and Not Just Educator, will explore the principles of anti-racist education and present 3 different stages of engagement with anti-racism, offering small but actionable steps that FSL educators can take within their personal and professional lives. Throughout the module, we suggest that you keep a notebook or a Word document nearby to write down your thoughts and reflections. Before we start, we invite you to pause and reflect on the following questions. We will turn to these questions at the end of the module. The following principles draw on the work of George Day, a foundational thinker in anti-racist education in Canada. In order to be anti-racist, we must understand that biologically there are no different human races. There's only one human race. That being said, race does exist because it is socially constructed. In other words, we place value on different races in our society. This may include benefiting from white supremacy or being a victim of racism. Race intersects with other identities, affording intersecting privileges and oppressions. This is usually referred to as intersectionality, a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in the late 80s. For example, linguistic discrimination may be experienced by anyone. However, a BIPOC French speaker may experience both linguistic discrimination and racism. Western societies and institutions were built around whiteness, to center whiteness, and to benefit white people. This means that education and schools are steeped in white supremacist ideologies. Many white people are unaware of their own privileges due to the pervasiveness of white supremacy. However, they still benefit from their perceived skin tone. It is essential to understand and acknowledge that within a white supremacist society, voices and knowledges of BIPOC people have been excluded from society and schooling. Further, school has actively played a role in reproducing inequities and racism. Just as society was not built for BIPOC people, school was not conceived for us to succeed. Anti-racist education seeks to counter the oppression of BIPOC voices and knowledges through culturally responsive and sustaining pedagogies, critical and integrated BIPOC representation, and challenging white supremacy. Anti-racist education is holistic education. This means engaging the whole student beyond their intellectual existence. Holistic education is ecological, social, cultural, political, and spiritual. Students do not come to school as an empty jar to be filled, but have valuable experiences and knowledge that they bring with them. The whole student must be taught and valued. We must understand that students' success in school is not isolated, but impacted by every other aspect of their lives, like environment, social and personal relationships, poverty, community, racism, and so on. School should be viewed as a working community between the school teachers, students, and families. Parents and families should not be blamed for social and historical injustices. We should instead be fostering positive communication with families and coming to communal solutions to problems. Families and students should be active agents in their education and in anti-racism, not on the sidelines. All anti-racist education must counter racism whenever it arises. Further, anti-racist education must teach students how to address racism with the end goal of transforming society at every level. Here is an example of 4 easy steps to address racism quickly in the moment. Step 1, stop the behavior. Step 2, name the behavior. Step 3, reference group norms and expectations. And finally, step 4, demand better behavior in the future or enact consequences. Above all, anti-racist education is about societal transformation. This might include smaller things like how we assess students, or larger elements like creating new school, municipal, provincial, or federal policies and laws. Anti-racist pedagogy requires that we raise students' critical consciousness and empower them to be anti-racist agents of change. In addition to awareness and knowledge of racism, anti-racist lessons explicitly call for action against racism. We now invite you to pause and reflect on the following questions. We have structured this module around Coney and Chan's approach to raising critical consciousness. We have adapted their critical consciousness levels to be a cycle of anti-racist consciousness and action. We present 3 stages of consciousness: the conscious educator, the proactive educator, and the forwardly active educator. Think of these as a cycle. We are constantly learning and becoming more conscious of different perspectives and oppressions. We might be proactive in some areas, but only conscious in others.
First stage we'll talk about is the conscious educator. A conscious educator has some critical consciousness and knowledge about colonialism, white supremacy, and anti-racism. If Module 2 was a deep examination of the self, at this stage we are beginning to synthesize this learning into concrete actions in our work and life, and which requires an examination of our practices around French and our students. Think of our praxis as a triangulation between ourselves, our students, and our subject. We've examined what we are bringing to the table, so now we need to see what our students and French are bringing into the classroom. To frame our discussion, our guiding question for this stage is, who is being represented? We will start by examining ways to look at how we represent the French language. There are multiple ways to approach increased diversity and representation, but all seek to decenter whiteness and disrupt the idea of français standard. These can include integrating diverse accents and dialects from all over and from within, presenting different kinds of standard French, quote unquote, and not elevating one, especially l'académie, over the rest, presenting francophones of different races, religions, cultures, citizenships, nationalities, and many more. RAD from CBC, Brut, and Jeune Afrique are some platforms that I've used in the past in the classroom, but I want to point out that social media in particular is an excellent way to find representation that has historically been excluded from government or private organizations. And you will find a wealth of diversity on social media that you won't find in so-called traditional media. In choosing a diversity of representation, it's important to note that this can run the risk of tokenism, box ticking, reinforcing biases, or trauma-based or deficit storytelling, i.e. focusing on what people lack instead of their assets, positives, or their joy. It also requires ensuring students have both knowledge and vocabulary to accurately speak about dialects, accents, race, nationalities, and much more. So be matter-of-fact and precise in your language and model this with students. Phrases like vient de, habite à, est canadien, canadienne, est venu are all loaded and carry meaning. Look at this photo and take 30 seconds to describe the people in it. Pause the video. When you return, look back at the language you used. What words did you employ? What language did you not use? What stories are you telling with this language, explicitly or implicitly? At this stage, pause to reflect and take stock. Who is represented in your French class? Which accents are present? What specific language, words, phrases, vocabulary do you use and teach to describe people and cultures? How often do you ensure that students understand concepts such as race or nationality? We've examined how French is represented, so we will now turn towards representation and diversity of students, i.e. student choice and voice. SHIN 2019's questions are valuable in framing the breadth of identities and depth of change that our students experience. Who have they been? Who are they now? Who do they want to be? In spaces where we hold institutional power, it's incumbent on us to give students many opportunities to express these ideas and to give them the vocabulary to do so. We must validate all identities, the Scottish German as well as the Iranian Turkish and the Korean Indian and everything in between, and not limit student expression to a project or beginning of the year introductions. Make opportunities to weave student identities throughout the year. Choose texts so that students see themselves wherever possible. For example, as I teach in a dominant East Asian school, I make opportunities to show French-speaking East Asians. And it's critical to not shelter students from language, no matter what language level and age they are. Just as we model precision in how we represent French, we also want to model precision in how we discuss our own identities. Some examples include vient de, habite à, je suis plus adjectif, nationalité, race, religion, plurals if necessary. Je parle plus langue, plurals if necessary. J'ai déménagé à, je suis venu de, je suis né à, j'ai habité à, mes grands-parents viennent de, habitent à, and make space for different family structures. Finally, as a conscious educator, be open to critical feedback and think through what people may say rather than going on the defensive. We're not educators in a vacuum, but rather constantly engaged in a push and pull with our community as we reflect on increasing the diversity of representation in our space. The second stage is for the proactive educator. You've spent time reevaluating who is represented in your class between teacher, student, and French. Now we add a fourth dimension, which is that of whiteness. Our key question is, how can I center BIPOC identities within white institutions? Remember that whiteness is not simply a race or skin color, but is also ideas, mores, practices, standards, and behaviors. So given this and the subject that we teach, it's imperative to not just give voice to those who've been oppressed, but to actively and intentionally center them in our work. Data shows that European and North American Francophones are at most 47% of the world's French speakers. This means Francophones from Africa, the Middle East, the Caribbean, and Asia-Oceania represent a growing majority in the world and thus should be represented as such in our classrooms. When counteracting whiteness and oppression, we have to be intentional and systematic. At the previous stage, as a conscious educator, we ensured that we had different voices represented. As a proactive educator, consciously take a tally of your texts. Do they represent the reality of a BIPOC majority? But also look at what BIPOC people are saying or how they are being presented in texts. Does it unconsciously reinforce systems of whiteness and white supremacy or unconscious biases that we already hold? Do they tell stories from an asset or deficit perspective? Look too at how you are teaching. What is your classroom setup? Who sets the agenda? How are students sitting? Are we allowing students to have multiple means of engagement, representation, and expression as per the UDL guidelines? And examine the balance of power. Who holds knowledge in the class? Who are the decision makers? Remember that we have all inherited a specific form of education that was created by a white, cis male Christian minority and whose legacy is actually still enshrined today. To give just one example, the Ontario Education Act does state that we as teachers are duty-bound to, quote, inculcate by precept and example respect for religion and the principles of Judeo-Christian morality, unquote. So as you consider these aspects of institutional whiteness, you're simultaneously looking at the relationship between students, teacher, whiteness, and the topic within French. This requires constant reflection and triangulation. Here is an example using myself and an adapted real-life scenario. The teacher is me, Jean Wan. I am Hong Kong Chinese, a settler in Canada, second-generation immigrant, and a dual citizen. Let's call the student Claire. Claire is Chinese from China, a first-generation immigrant, and a permanent resident. When we look at systemic whiteness, I teach at a historically white school and institution with a majority white faculty and a majority BIPOC student population. And for the topic, let's say I've chosen a text on a Black designer from Cameroon in my core French grade 8 class. Let's start with some self-examination and pre-planning. Questions I might ask myself: why did I choose this text? What do I know about Cameroon and Africa, its basic history, language, geography, relationship to the rest of the world? What do I know that is similar, factually or thematically, to the text that can be leveraged for understanding? What biases, assumptions, or stereotypes did I inherit or were reinforced that would affect how I present this text? And what knowledge do I need in order to give voice from an asset perspective? Now let's look at how I might approach teaching Claire. What knowledge and perspectives have I seen Claire express about culture? What does Claire know, not just about Cameroon, but about Africa? Its history, language, geography, relationship to the rest of the world? What might Claire have learnt in previous classes, schools, or at home? What does Claire know that is similar, factually or thematically, to the text that can then be leveraged for understanding. What biases, assumptions, or stereotypes might Claire have inherited or were reinforced that would affect how they understand this text? What questions and ideas can I anticipate from Claire, and where might they be challenged? How does Claire best learn, and what engages them? After having reflected on these aspects, I have to finally consider, am I ready to use this text? Is Claire ready to grapple with this text, linguistically and thematically? You can see that as I plan how to use this text, I'm challenging systemic whiteness at each point and from different angles. It's like chopping down a really stubborn, overgrown weed. You might have to pull at it from one end, then turn 90 degrees and dig around with a shovel, then rotate yet again and bring out the hacksaw. The same principle applies here, where you find different entry points to decenter whiteness and center BIPOC identities. And then this is further repeated on this micro level for each and every student. And if the answer at any point is no, the student or I am not ready for this text, then it doesn't necessarily mean choosing another text. It just means making sure that the groundwork is there. This takes time and effort, but it's worth it. Centering BIPOC identities also means centering their practices and implementing them in our work. Remember too that students are not empty jars, and if we approach this work holistically, we will be rewarded. Our students come with vast stores of knowledge, tradition, understandings, and experiences that we should lean on as the foundation of our work. To end this section as a proactive educator, take some time to pause and reflect. How well do I know my students? How can their knowledge and experiences become integral parts of learning? What have students experienced that can be uplifted? Am I uplifting my BIPOC students compared to my white students? Am I uplifting all BIPOC students compared to each other? What historical, cultural understandings and biases are being brought into the class? And finally, this module series is focused on anti-racism, but all of this work equally applies to centering 2S LGBTQ+ identities. Who am I representing and uplifting outside of the cis heteronormative lens?
This final stage to anti-racism is for those who are thinking forward in their approach to anti-racism. Being forwardly active means being able to integrate and sustain anti-racism within your classes and beyond. The key question for this stage is, how can I integrate and sustainably maintain anti-racist pedagogy and action? Integrating and sustaining anti-racism can happen through using anti-racism as a framework in long-range planning. This would mean integrating anti-racism throughout the entire course through lessons, units, reflections, and discussions. Long-term anti-racist plans could center the Learning for Justice standards. These standards have 4 domains: identity, diversity, justice, and action. These standards may serve as course learning goals and integrate well with the FSL curriculum, although adjustments will be needed for language levels. The identity domain centers learning about their own and others' identities in a way to foster pride, communication, and equity. The diversity domain deals with learning about themselves and others in a diverse society and being able to communicate differences in a respectful way. Diversity deals with developing empathy in students. The justice domain addresses awareness of injustices, while the action domain trains students in how to deal with these injustices. You can integrate anti-racism into your long-range plans through developing the curriculum strand D, intercultural competence. For example, if working with the grade 10 French immersion curriculum, the cultural focus is Africa and Asia. You could integrate various cultural groups from these continents, focusing on different cultures throughout the course. Teaching intercultural competence through an anti-racist lens looks like navigating different cultures in a respectful manner, using an asset-based perspective, interrogating power structures, and taking action against oppression. The first element has to do with navigating different cultures. This means learning about both surface cultures, so celebrations, music, food, and deep cultures, like beliefs, values, and attitudes. Cultural examination should also be linguistic. You can explore different accents, syntax, and lexicons with your students, but be careful not to reinforce or presume standard or Parisian French, and instead value the language for its uniqueness. For instance, you might compare Senegalese slang to Quebecois slang, French slang, and even slang from other languages. You could also compare how younger Senegalese generations speak to how older generations speak. By including multiple comparisons, you can decenter France. Cultural study does not have to be limited to one geographic area and can include looking at local Senegalese immigrants in Canada. Throughout cultural learning, it is important that students learn to understand differences without placing value or judgment on the cultures that they are studying. This can be achieved through modeling by the teacher, for example, talking about Senegal without saying judgmental things like, this is bad, by having students confront their biases through critical reflection, through journals or discussions about our own cultural beliefs and belief systems, through avoiding stereotypes, through presenting multiple perspectives, and through an asset-based approach. An asset-based approach is the opposite of a deficit approach. In a deficit approach, we learn only about the negative aspects of a community, or we talk about them in only negative terms. For instance, saying things like third world countries or backwards ideas all portray deficit thinking. Also, talking only about the traumatic, painful, or negative experiences of a group, like slavery, poverty, or political unrest, is deficit ideology. Another example is assuming a community is oppressed when they may not be, or they may in fact be powerful agents of resistance and change. An asset-based approach does the opposite. It presents positive elements of a community, including their successes, achievements, skills, and acts of resistance. It answers the question, what is this community doing really well? What are Senegalese achievements or examples of Senegalese excellence and joy? Importantly, within an asset-based approach, contemporary issues should still be explored. However, this should be done critically and include multiple perspectives to avoid the danger of a single story. How are different cultures using their agency to resist oppression? This connects to the next element of cultural teaching in an anti-racist framework, interrogating power structures. Ask yourself, who does and does not hold power? In what situations and why? Here we investigate instances of racial injustice and resistance. Approaching this through an intersectional lens, consider how different identities impact experiences of oppression. How does racial injustice and resistance intersect with other oppressions? Given France's history of colonialism, it is essential to question colonialism and la francophonie. Cultures are heavily influenced and changed by colonization, and societies continue to be influenced by France today. What is indigenous Senegalese culture or cultures? How has it changed and evolved due to colonialism? What colonial structures remain in place today in Senegal? What is the relationship between Senegal and France? Without addressing colonialism within Francophone cultures, it is impossible to fully understand that culture. Finally, anti-racist education demands action. When studying formerly colonized people, as a Western nation, we must challenge and work against white Western saviorism. Instead, we should ask ourselves and our students what our roles and responsibilities are as local and global citizens in helping address injustice. What can we do? What should we do? What do the affected people want us to do? There's no easy answer to this question. However, working with community members, being aware of our privileges, and being open to feedback will help determine the best course of action in each unique situation. Action may look like a letter writing campaign, a fundraiser, awareness raising, volunteering in a local community, connecting with Senegalese students via the internet, and so on. Again, small but actionable steps should be taken. We are unlikely to solve global racial discrimination in one class. Please take a moment to pause and reflect on the following questions. Within your personal life, forward action could look like long-term learning and action that you do to ensure you are maintaining anti-racism throughout the years, and not just doing it once in a while. This might include setting goals for your anti-racist learning and actions over the course of a given time period, for example, a couple of months or a year. At the forward action stage, we actively challenge power structures in our schools and societies. Challenging power structures requires action. Educators could critically analyze policies around discipline, seeing where instances of injustice and racism arise. From here, they should propose a way forward, either transforming or repealing the policy. For example, instead of out-of-school suspensions, suspensions might happen entirely in school so that students' learning is not disrupted and restorative justice may happen. Pause here to review some suggestions for things you can do with your colleagues and in your personal life to interrogate power structures. Students and parents should be involved in the course planning process as much as possible. This does not mean that they should be doing the work for you, but that they should have a meaningful say in what topics are studied, how assessments might look, field trips a class may take, and so on. Here, teachers should be consulting with students and families throughout the year, not just at the beginning or during pre-scheduled parent-teacher nights. Families should be invited invited to participate in many different ways in order to support those with different schedules than the teacher. This may include video conferencing with families in evenings, or before school, creating feedback surveys, creating a course newsletter that goes out on a monthly basis, phoning parents, hosting course planning nights, and so on. The last element of anti-racist pedagogy is honest reflection. No matter your level of experiences with anti-racism, reflection is essential to see what areas you are succeeding in and what areas you still need to work on. You also need to honestly reflect on your practice to see what is actually sustainable in the long term. Anti-racist work is hard, time-consuming, and emotionally exhausting. It is important to plan in a way that will not result in you burning out after a month of undertaking this essential and never-ending work. We recommend reflecting at least once a month and at the end of every course or year. Here, we invite you to pause and reflect on the following questions for both your personal life and your professional one. As we conclude our module, we will leave you with a few reflection questions, ideas, and resources. Above all, it is important to remember that we can all be anti-racist. Anti-racism does not have to be a huge-scale approach for every person, but can instead be small, consistent actions. To summarize, you may be at the conscious stage and be aware of racism and are now moving toward anti-racist practice. This may include diversifying who's represented in your French classes, including the students themselves in that representation. You may be at the proactive anti-racist stage, which includes intentionally giving voice to those who have been oppressed, centering BIPOC perspectives, examining and triangulating between racial relationships, and making opportunities to educate holistically. Or you may be at the forward action stage, which includes long-term planning and integration of anti-racism in your pedagogy, challenging power structures, involving students and family in your planning, and honest reflection. You may be at different stages at different times throughout the year. As we learn about new people, perspectives, and oppressions, we move through this cycle. The end goal is not to be forwardly active, but rather constantly learning. Returning to the principles of anti-racism, here we suggest a few small actions for each principle. A master list can be found in the viewer's guide. For social construction consequences of race, you can counter incorrect statements about race being biological. For intersectionality, you can reflect on your students' intersecting identities. For the pervasiveness of white privilege and white supremacy, you can reflect on white supremacy and how it manifests in your school and classroom. For understanding and countering educational oppression of BIPOC, you can counter deficit narratives when you hear your friends, family, or colleagues say them. For holistic education, you can start bringing in one or two elements into your teaching. For positive relationships between school, student, and family, you can attend cultural events from other cultures and get involved in your community. For stopping racism, you can address it every time you hear it, whether it be at school, with friends, or family. For societal transformation, you can participate in anti-racist activism, like signing a petition, attending a march, writing to your MPP, or volunteering. As you move through your anti-racist journey, remember there is no one perfect approach to anti-racism, but many imperfect ones. An anti-racist person is always learning and always reflecting.
We now return to our overarching questions for this module presented at the beginning. Who do I want to be as an educator moving forward? What does anti-racism mean to me? How am I being actively anti-racist? How am I being passively anti-racist? How may I unconsciously or consciously be reproducing racism? How will I integrate anti-racism into my practice as a French teacher, into my social and personal life? Thank you for engaging with Module 3, and please do not hesitate to reach out to us at rmkunis@yorku.ca and jean.wan@scs.on.ca.
Your support and feedback support the development of future professional learning series. Please take a moment to complete the following survey. Should you have any questions or comments about this module, please send an email to omlta@omlta.org. These modules were created under the leadership of the Ontario Modern Languages Teachers Association. The OMLTA is a non-profit professional association that has been supporting French as a second language and international languages teachers of all programs and grade levels since 1886. These modules were designed to support FSL teachers to becoming anti-racist FSL educators through the development of the foundations presented in this series so they may feel more comfortable, confident, and equipped to be equitable and inclusive in their second language learning classrooms in a manner that is sincere and authentic. The OMLTA would like to thank the Ministry of Education for its financial support in developing this module series. In addition, a special thanks goes to the educators who contributed their expertise and their experience to the creation and development of these modules.